I've got my cargo trailer in the garage here tonight, and what I'm going to do is install a torsion axle lift kit to gain some ground clearance and give me more room between the tire and the top of the fender. I've leveled the trailer out, and from the floor of the garage to the bottom of the frame is 13 inches. And if we go from the floor to the top of the fender, we are looking at just a little over 29 inches, probably about 29 and a quarter. The parts in the kit, this is a kit for a 3,500 pound axle. Part number is K71-707-01. It's a number 10 kit. But we've got enough bolts and flat washers and nuts, and these are actually a locking style nut, and then 2 large spacer brackets. I've installed one of these before and it wasn't too terribly difficult, just a little bit time consuming, and it requires a good assortment of floor jacks and jack stands. I've lowered the front of the trailer to give more clearance here, and then placed a floor jack and some wood blocks under the frame, and I probably need more wood blocks. I did put a pair of jack stands, one on each side up at the front, and then lowered the tongue jack down so that the jack stands are supporting the front of the trailer. And how a torsion axle is attached to the frame is there's this bracket that's welded to the frame, and then this bracket is part of the axle. So you unbolt one bolt on each side, and the entire axle drops out of the frame, and then those brackets that I showed earlier, those are spacers that then attach to this bracket, and then the axle attaches to those spacers. And what we're going to need is a couple more jacks, or maybe some jack stands. And then over here you can see that the wiring for the brake assembly goes right through that hole, so we need to cut the wires for the brake and pull them through that hole. And what I will do is cut them fairly close to the back of the brake backing plate. I've peeled back the split loom on the wiring, and right there you can see some splices, so that's where I'll cut, is just cut right where those existing splices are at. And using a 15/16 wrench and a 15/16 socket on my impact driver, I will remove the nuts and the bolts. And I don't want to pull the bolts out yet. Before I do that, I need to support the axle. And this is a noisy job, so I'm wearing some ear protection and some safety glasses. And then I'll go ahead and repeat the process for the other side. Then I've put my floor jack underneath the axle to support it, and the next thing I'll do is pull out the bolts and then slowly lower my floor jack. Okay, I loosened the axle. Let's see what happens. Yeah, it's definitely not gonna drop out enough to get that spacer in there, I don't think. And so what I've done here on the other side is I've put a floor jack underneath, pulled the bolts out, loosen the axle up, and then drop the axle down. If you drop it much further, what happens is the entire axle is going to rotate and try to fall. And the reason for that is because the center of gravity is not straight over the axle tube. And that's due to the weight of the brake drums. The center of the axle is right there. So that's why the instructions say to only do one side at a time. So I'm back on the right side of the trailer. I lowered my jack just a little bit. You can see the gap between the axle tube and my block of wood. And that's what I didn't want to happen. So that little mistake was a result of using a floor jack that moves. So the axle shifted a little bit when it came down, and the pad of the floor jack may not have been centered under the axle. So anyway, the floor jack moved. So let's just go ahead and install this bracket right now. We'll insert our bolts through the spacer. Insert it into the frame bracket, put the flat washer on, and then the nut. And these nuts are a special locking nut that only install one direction. They're not a nylon locking nut. They're a completely different arrangement, and I'll show you that later. Okay, that's loosely fit into place. So next thing I'll do is go ahead and partially tighten these bolts. You just have to use some hand tools. Well, it's not going to work as good as I thought either. I need a longer leverage. Raising the axle back up into place. Kind of struggling with the hardware just because that lock nut is so tight that I need a lot of leverage to get it even partially snug. See, I've still got probably 1/4 of an inch right there. When installing your hardware to attach the spacer to the frame bracket, you'll put these bolts in first, tighten them, and then torque them down before installing your bolts that hold the axle in place. As you can see, if you put all the bolts in, then you can't tighten these down because this is in the way. These lock nuts have one side that's slightly elongated. That's the round side. That's the elongated side. And see those serration marks? Those are on opposite sides. Those are tool marks that are used to crimp this and elongate it. So the non-elongated side is the side that threads onto the bolt. When attaching the axle to the bracket, check your spacing here as well as here. This is flush right here, and this is relatively flush. So make sure it's as centered as best you can get it on both sides. And then on this hardware, when you use your bolt up here, you also use a flat washer on top and a flat washer on the bottom. And then your nut the hole in the bracket as well as on the axle. Those are elongated. You can see how that slides back and forth. So when you tighten these bolts down, try to slide these out as far as they'll go and just hold them in place with your tools while you tighten them. And once they're tightened by hand with your tools, then they need to be torqued to 130 to 150 foot-pounds. Once you have all of your hardware torqued down, then secure your brake lines and reconnect, or your brake wiring. I've routed it through this hole and then used a tie wrap to secure it to the actual mounting bracket on the axle, and then kind of tucked it up here. Basically, you just want to keep it away from the back side of the tire so it doesn't rub. And then this shows how I've routed it along the back of the backing plate and over to where it goes through the backing plate. So I've got the tires and wheels reinstalled, torqued my lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Check your owner's manual on your axle to see what the torque spec is for your particular axle. And we re-leveled the trailer into the bottom of the frame. We are at about 15.5 inches. And then looking over here at the fender, you can see how much more clearance there is between the bottom of the fender and the top of the tire. There's actually enough room there where you could go up to a next size larger tire, which would be an ST 225 75 R15. So the top of the fender, we're right at 32 inches.